Yep. I mean, to be fair, I did see this coming from a mile away. Oh, man. Okay, let's get a few things out of the way before we keep going and some of you impulsively decide to get mad at me in the comments. I don't think this is a bad movie. I don't think it's a bad adaptation. I don't even think that it's overrated. This is one of the best Dreamworks movies of all time, and anybody who follows me on Twitter will tell you how it was my most anticipated movie of 2024.
Patience is the key.
There were a lot of factors that came into play with why I had such high expectations going into this, but two things stuck out in my mind when that announcement first came about back in 2023. Number one, the fact that it was going to be directed by Chris Sanders, who I assume most of you would probably know best from co-directing the original How to Train Your Dragon and Lilo and Stitch with Dean DeBlua. And I'll get to why that's significant later on in the video, beyond the fact that those are two really good and widely respected animated movies. The man's got the credentials in my eyes, and bear in mind that this was long before the first teaser trailer dropped, but after the fact, I mean, as soon as I saw it on the big screen, I was like, this is gonna be critically acclaimed. People are gonna call this one of their all-time favorite films from the studio. Hell, I know it's a little early to tell, but I think this might be the film that finally gets Dreamworks that second best animated feature win. Yes, I know the Oscars don't matter in the grand scheme of things, but it would be nice to say Academy Award for Best Animated Feature winner The Wild Robots. Or Best Adapted Screenplay, probably not, but a man can dream. All of the signs were pointing towards success, but the second and more significant reason as to why I was so excited about this movie should be pretty apparent. Once again, if you follow me on Twitter, this right here, my original copy that I got when I was 13 back in 2017. I don't know where the cover is. I probably lost it at one point and never bothered to get another copy. Now let's get this out of the way. No, I don't think this being based on a book is a sign of a lack of originality at all. I did see some people saying that, and I thought to myself, like DreamWorks has been doing this for years now. When did this become a problem? Sentiments like these are part of the reason why terminology like unoriginal or doesn't need to exist needs to stop being used so liberally, even in the case of sequels and spin-off media. Look, we're all mostly exhausted by the monolith of forgettable and or bad animated movies that happen to fall into one of these categories, at least with mainstream American animation. But usually there's way more reasons for them being flawed that often get oversimplified and generalized through the blanket statement not being original. That is a whole nother conversation that we're not gonna have here though. The point is, I love this book so much, y'all have to understand. It's not even really just nostalgia either. In fact, you can consider this entire review a glowing recommendation. I think in the case of Dreamworks' other recent book adaptations like The Bad Guys or both Dave Pilkey series, they're not impossible, but difficult to recommend to people who didn't grow up with them. Basically what I'm saying is I categorize this as a middle grade book the same way I would categorize something like Percy Jackson, something that can for the most part be enjoyed by anybody at any age. All that being said, I wasn't planning on going into this movie on my high horse to nitpick inaccuracies compared to the original source material. So I don't want this to be interpreted as me thinking my opinion is more valid than somebody who's only seen the movie. I do think that I can add a bit of extra insight as someone who's been a fan of the book series for a long time, because I've loved this story for as long as I can remember and was curious to see what would be changed and what would remain intact when adapting it into a new medium. Change is often necessary when it comes to this, as there are advantages and disadvantages whenever you're transitioning from one format of storytelling to another. And as long as those changes still make for an engaging experience, I think it's okay. Dreamworks has been very smart with the books they've recently been adapting into films, as then often being children's books with fairly short and simple stories means that there's inevitably going to be elements that need to be added to be stretched out into a feature-length film. Shrek, How to Train Your Dragon, The Bad Guys, Captain Underpants. There's a lot more creative liberty with what can be added because the stories are either very short and not particularly thematically nuanced, or have enough episodic material to pull from while keeping true to the general setup. This isn't me trying to devalue the book counterparts of these movies by any means. I'm just pointing out that oftentimes filmmakers choose these books because they see something absent from them that can make an already beloved story connect with more people that can be best executed in a film format. The Wild Robots, not really an exception in this regard. There are parts of it that are very different from the book, some of which are things that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things or work to actively make the story better. Any kind of book accuracy is effectively a form form of fan service, and I'm just willing to take what I can get in that regard. Which is why I'm going to give you a very simplified summary of the book's premise to lay some groundwork for discussing it alongside the film. The Wild Robot is a story about a robot named Rosm Unit 7134 being stranded on a deserted island and forced to survive in the wilderness, while also carrying the responsibility of raising a young gosling after accidentally causing the death of his entire family. I would have put that in the spoiler category, but they gave that away in the second clip they released, so I'm presuming most of you knew that going in. This led to a smaller point of contention amongst people who were unfamiliar with the book, and that was being underwhelmed that the animals would be talking despite the first trailer suggesting they'd be silent. It's understandable to be disappointed by this, but then you had a few people going as far to say that the animals having dialogue was correlated to the film's quality and maturity level, and only stuff for kids has talking animals. Which is just objectively inaccurate. I can give you a very extensive list of counterexamples. Sing is not the only animated franchise with animals that exists, okay? For those of you unaware, one of Roz's functions is her fluency in multiple languages across the world, but being outside of her usual environment means that there's initially a language barrier between her and the other animals. So she periodically learns how to understand and communicate with them by translating their grunts and growls into whatever language you're reading the text in. And because the story is told from her point of view, we hear everything she hears. So this is book accurate. It's not just there to be more appealing to kids or furries. But the reason why I find this critique so frustrating is that characters don't need to be silent for animators to use visuals to tell the story. This is significant to the way things play out with Roz herself and the way she interacts with the wild. One scene I can point to is Bright Bill's origins, which, okay, this was one of the things I was most curious about going into the movie because this is probably the darkest and most horrifying thing to happen in a Dreamworks movie since Lord Shen tried to wipe pandas off the face of the earth.
There are no more pandas.
Everything leading up to this moment establishes Roz as being competent, but her following protocol in a place where it wasn't kept in mind makes her prone to unintentional harm and frightening/angering the other animals. She doesn't harbor resentment towards them because of this though. She doesn't feel anything unless it's a direct reaction to obstacles that hinder her from completing her tasks. Everything she does is in line with her baseline programming, with no emotions attached. In the scenario with the most gravitas attached to it though, the writers don't have this characterization be established through silly antics like being sprayed by a skunk or a bunch of raccoons pillaging, but through the music and the way the scene is directed. If you notice, there's many visual touches that show Roz as looking at this tragedy of her own doing purely through an analytical lens. Her facial expressions show signs of confusion rather than guilt, horror, or shock at what's happened, and her using broken eggshells as her way of determining that one of the goslings survived, which is why she later tries to stop Bright Bill from hatching because based on what she's seen in her mind, the egg breaking means he's gonna die. We are explicitly told this information through the dialogue later on in the film, but the way the event itself is presented is the animator's way of showing what they can do simply through what's being shown to us. And that's not even getting into the technical side of things, just the way this scene feels so textured with the rain and debris and how much detail there is. It's their way of conveying what's happening through a language they speak fluently. I'm not going to analyze each individual scene like this, though that's very much doable on my part, but watching this on the big screen really made me appreciate this film's animation a lot. This is why it was so satisfying to also hear Lupita Nyong'o cite the incredible job that the animators did with the transition from page to screen and bringing these characters to life.
And the painstaking work that goes into every single frame, and the fact that it's painted over by human hands, what he created, this technology that DreamWorks created for this particular project, it feels both nostalgic and futuristic. You know, there's something, it's pulling you in both directions, and I think that's what makes it just so overwhelmingly beautiful. And yeah, it's just not one of those things that you can really take credit for. It's just like, thanks for having me, you know.
Now's a pretty good time to segue into talking about Roz herself, though I'm gonna save a lot of that stuff for the spoiler section. As I said earlier, her main conflict comes from not having the tools or programming, in her own words, to fit in with the wild, which includes raising Bright Bill. She views saving the sole survivor of the accident that she caused being where her task starts and ends, and leaves him on his own assuming he can survive by himself. She gets flustered and confused as to why he continues to keep following her around after the fact.
That gosling stalks me, emits noise, and makes simple tasks more complicated or impossible.
And her only priority is returning to where she came from until Pinktail tells her she has to do this in a way she'll understand. That's why her ability to communicate with the other animals is important. They're the ones that tell her what's at stake and that she needs to do more to ensure his survival. Much of what she learns about empathy and parenthood comes from these side characters that she wouldn't understand if she couldn't communicate with them. Sorry, I know I'm bringing this up a lot, I really dislike people trying to use this as a dig against the movie's complexity. It would make their connection as a found family throughout the story feel less organic if Roz is purely relying on trying to read their movements, something she fails to do in the opening scene.
My communication package includes strategies for
Even independent of the book, making the characters not being able to talk would mean losing their strong personalities that make them have such good chemistry with Roz, and in my opinion would make them stand out less. A lack of dialogue shouldn't just be done for the sake of appearing more artistically valuable, and it's one of the most important things that I don't think should be changed about the book. Once again, not every piece of family-friendly media with talking animals is Sing.
The funny thing about science is it's often thought of as like the opposite of creativity, but that's really not true at all. It takes a lot of creativity.
Here is an excerpt from Peter Brown's author's note when talking about his inspiration for writing the story.
I've always been fascinated by robots, by the real robots that exist today, by the robots that will exist in the future, and by the fantastic robot characters that only exist in books and films. It's funny how many philosophical questions spring when we think about artificial human beings. Do we want robots that can think and feel like a person? Would we trust robots to perform surgery, care for children, or police our cities? In a world where robots did all the work, how would we humans spend our time? I'm also fascinated by the natural world. Animals have such predictable behavior and follow such rigid routines that at times they seem almost robotic. And somewhere along the line, it occurred to me that animal instincts are kind of like computer programs. Thanks to their instincts, animals automatically run from danger, build nests, and stay close to their families. And they often do these things without thinking, as if they've been programmed to perform specific actions at specific times. Surprising. Wild animals and robots have some things in common.
The entire basis of the narrative came from finding similarities between multiple kinds of species that couldn't seem more different from each other on the surface. And that's a setup that Chris Sanders has mastered. But the thing that got me so enthusiastic about him being the one directing this movie isn't that, it's what he understands about the nuances of parenthood. It's a theme that frequently makes its way into his screenplays. I have a theory with both the films he's co-directed with Dean DeBlua that the progression of the bond between the protagonist and the outsider who's a different species than them.
You're built to destroy. You can never belong.
That side of the narrative came from DeBlua, as that's the emotional center of the other two films in the How to Train Your Dragon trilogy, neither of which Chris Sanders was a writer for. But if you watch the How to Train Your Dragon movies side by side, the first one is the only one where the relationship between Hiccup and his dad is a major contributor to the themes of the story. He has to deal with how his relationship with Toothless negatively impacts his already strained relationship with Stoic, being his polar opposite. Likewise, Stoic has an arc of his own where he not only learns to let go of his fear of dragons, but accept his son for his own unique set of strengths as a Viking that he previously overlooked. And as average as that other Dreamworks film he directed is, The Croods being a movie about generational divides and overprotection of kids going too far, he's proven to be very versatile with not just the themes about family, but exploring them through different types of familial structures. You can tell that he's in his element with almost every aspect of this screenplay, and I think that's because the theme of parenthood is integral to the central relationship that develops. Once Roz's new goal becomes teaching Brightbow how to survive despite the odds being stacked against him, she gets help from Fink, a fox who previously tried to eat the baby goose but eventually decides to help her out in his own finky little way.
Oh, that's nice.
I don't think him being the one that the two of them end up being dependent on the most emotionally is an accident. And I'm not just saying that as a Kung Fu Panda fan.
There are no accidents.
Yes, I know.
Chris Sanders could have picked any of the multitude of side characters to bulk up their roles in the story, and he chose him. The most apparent reason for this being both him and Roz are ostracized from their community, albeit for different reasons. While Roz's struggles to fit in come from an unwillingness for the other animals to get to know her, Finn has personality traits that make him undesirable to everyone around him, being portrayed as manipulative and a habitual liar. They balance these unlikable characteristics through giving him a lot of charisma that comes from a place of arrogance most of the time, but still makes for a fun interpretation of this character.
Do you believe everything you hear?
Yes.
Noted.
Roz's inability to understand emotion comes into play here a lot. Her not having any knowledge about raising a child means she's impressionable to everything she's taught about it, and doesn't filter out advice on the basis of personal experience or who's giving it to her. More than any story that I've seen / read about parenthood, this is one that fully embraces the idea that it's an ongoing learning process. You don't instantly become ridden with wisdom and all the answers about raising a kid as soon as you have one, and there's nothing wrong with accepting help. Yet there does seem to be a belief that the only people that can give any meaningful insight on how to best take care of your kid, or care about kids in general, or other parents. I bring all this up because Fink isn't exactly the type of individual you'd expect to be equipped with quality parenting advice, but he ends up being the one that Roz gets the most tips from with raising Brightbill. When she's about to tell Brightbill the truth about his parents, Fink discourages it in reasonable fear of traumatizing him, or the trial and error of having to give Brightbill his name. As funny as it is to watch Roz logic her way through tasks like this, it reveals a more subtle theme about how people can give useful parenting advice without having kids of their own. They can draw from both positive and negative experiences with their own parents, or experiences period. Would it really make a difference if the things that were used to help Roz came from Pinktail, who had 7 kids, or Fink? No, I can't say that it would. Here's what a lot of parents have to realize. Most morally decent people want the next generation to be well off just as much as you do, and acknowledging flaws on your part and being open to constructive criticism doesn't mean that you're a bad parent. One does have to be open-minded when it comes to learning, and although Roz is an extreme example of this, her being this susceptible shows the good that can come with getting perspectives on parenthood from a diverse set of people. Animals, damn it, why does this always happen? One of the most common struggles that come with longer books being adapted to film is pacing. Including every single subplot from a book could potentially mean a ludicrously long runtime, which is why certain details get cut out to condense a story to fit a smaller one. Usually this is limited to direct adaptations, which are different from and much more concerned about accuracy than loose adaptations that mostly self-assign more creative liberty with their scripts. And the latter has always felt like the better approach when it comes to this type of filmmaking. Brightbill's journey from childhood to young adulthood is a lot slower in the book than it is in the movie, but I think that since that's a journey that's more heavily driven by characters rather than the events themselves, it's okay if everything doesn't play out exactly the way it does in the book to get to this point. This time being reduced to a simple montage allows the film to keep its forward momentum rather than dragging this part of their lives out to the point where it overstays its welcome. What people are asking the audience to devote their time to is different in film than it is in literature. One you're usually meant to experience in one sitting, the other can be enjoyed more periodically, neither of which is the correct option, but different expectations mean different goals. This is what I was talking about when I put Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio at the top of my ranking of the animated films that came out that year, where a filmmaker finds harmony with the original body of work and what they want to say with it. Any trope can be done properly, even ones that are overused and generally not good. You like to be filled! The liar revealed trope is when a character has to be deceitful to other characters in order to advance the plot, and always ends with them getting caught with it having very minimal impact on the trust previously established in the relationship. A trope that's far from my least favorite in fiction, but can be a bit annoying. Roz takes Fink's advice and hides the fact that she killed Brightbill's entire biological family, but he eventually finds out by some geese that are harassing him for not fitting in with the other members of the flock. She rightfully comes to defend him, and they mock the fact that he thinks she's his actual mother.
That thing killed your mother. Everyone knows that.
Brightbill gets angry at her for not telling him this sooner and runs away. Here's why this story development works other than being accurate to the book. One thing that the liar revealed trope often fails to consider is motivation. If a character lies for selfish reasons and their own personal gain, it means that the time it takes for the ones being lied to usually ends up feeling rushed and disingenuous. If I found out I was being used by somebody I thought was a friend, I wouldn't be as quick to forgive, or at the very least, trust. Roz's motivations, however, are both sympathetic and in line with her character. She has a reason for not telling Brightbill what happened. That's what she was told by Fink would be the best course of action. When that backfires, she has no way of knowing how to fix things, aligning with the motif of analyzing her way through empathy. And because this reveal happens early enough in the film, the melodrama that stems from these events is compelling. It's not just something that happens right before the final act with no time for the impact of these revelations to be felt. Brightbill still has to learn how to fly so he can migrate during the winter, so Roz helps him out with some added support from another goose elder named Longbeak. Also, she gets her prosthetic foot from the book. That's just such great attention to detail. Her helping Brightbill learn how to fly isn't what gives him added perspective on why she lied to him about where he really comes from, though. So what ultimately does? Well, that's where those themey themes come in again. Having more life experience can often change the way that you engage with fiction, and I think a lot of what the book has to say about how parents treat their kids, and vice versa, are things that I didn't understand the significance of when I was 13. Roz has made a lot of sacrifices for making sure that Brightbill was able to get this far that he was unaware of, and knowing this gives him some humility and recognizes the fact that she's always had his best interest in mind, even though it caused him a lot of anguish. I have a caveat that I should mention before saying what I'm about to say. There is a line that needs to be drawn when it comes to extending grace to parents. It shouldn't be done to a point where it enables controlling or emotionally abusive behavior, and you have a right to cut them out of your life if they perpetually mistreat you. There's a difference between loving your child and treating them however you want and calling it love out of obligation.
I love you, but you are not serious people.
Harm isn't always deliberate though, and it's important to recognize that flaws from our parents, even some of the ones that come at our expense, sometimes are a result of them being human like the rest of us. And there are certain ways you can't fully empathize with them when you're younger. I think that's something very significant in order to maintain a healthy relationship that carries into adulthood. Brightbill's resentment towards Ross comes from an insecurity about not fitting in, and he thinks that could have been avoided had he known about it earlier instead of Roz making the choice for him. Roz is never depicted as an optimal parent, but she is well-meaning, and Brightbill making the decision to eventually forgive Roz, I interpret that as an optimistic way of saying to parents that if you genuinely care about your child's well-being and are willing to hold yourself accountable and admit when you're wrong, they will see that.
I love you.
There's another major change from Roz herself that I'm gonna elaborate on later in the video, but is somewhat relevant to what I have to say here. In the book, Roz has amnesia, and I wasn't sure what approach that Dreamworks was gonna go for with that part of the story, since it leads to the book ending on a cliffhanger and the rest of the story getting followed up in the sequel, The Wild Robot Escapes. In addition to surviving in the wild and taking care of Brightbill, Book Roz is having an identity crisis of her own. She has no knowledge of her life before she came to this island, and it's kept a mystery until the second book. The movie departs from that quite a bit. Roz has more agency in terms of what her goals are. Finding out where she belongs intersects with not feeling like she belongs where she currently is. Before she trains Brightbill to help him learn how to fly, she finds out that she is also the only one who survived a tragic accident. There were a total of 5 robots that got washed at sea. She's the only one of them that survived. So the synecdoche of characters having no one to fall back on before meeting each other is why Roz, Fink, and Brightbill are the central trio. What they changed from the book though, other than Fink's role, was how Roz fixes one of the robots and finds out where she comes from. It's no longer a mystery that needs to be solved. I interpret that as serving 2 purposes. One, as a way of aiding Brightbill in completing his own arc when the other geese get stranded in her factory during a storm. Everything that we know about what happens when he flies south in the book is orally expressed to us after the fact. fact. I think this scene makes it so that Brightbill has a satisfying arc independent from his relationship with Roz. He's able to come into his own as a leader through his knowledge of Roslyn Protocol as they're all being attacked by them, and it shows that the things that were considered weird about him that he got from his mom ended up saving the day. But secondly, I don't think where Roz comes from is necessary to what Chris Sanders wants to emphasize with the story. The way Roz interprets Brightbill flying south is a sign that he's where he belongs, and after she believes she's ruined his relationship, thinking leaving the island is the best logical course of action. Any decision that isn't based in logic is seen as defective, or a glitch that none of the other ROSM units have.
You are defective. You are in the wrong place.
But what we soon learn about Roz is that what's her greatest weakness also ends up being her greatest strength. Part of the protocol includes pacifism and not deliberately causing harm to anyone. The logical side of her brain is what causes her to save all the other animals from a violent winter storm despite not being liked by any of them.
No one likes me?
Nor me. But right now, we are their only chance.
This scene is the one that comes directly after Brightbill leads the flock to safety during that same storm, drawing a parallel between both of them coming into their own about what's different about them. Acceptance like that by people you aren't related to isn't always easy, but caring enough about someone to do so is what a chosen family is all about, where you don't have to change core characteristics about someone to love them, even if some of the idiosyncrasies are things you're not used to or get on your nerves. It's uplifting to see the other animals be inspired by Roz's compassion to the point that they're all willing to hold a truce while inside the shelter she's built. Fink even gets a chance to step into a leadership role and keep everyone in check. In case you couldn't tell by now, I have overwhelmingly positive opinions about this movie as an adaptation. But I do have one very, very small criticism when watching it that I've been saving. I've had to make a lot of revisions for this segment of the video because in the time that it's taken for me to watch this movie twice, start writing the script, and getting one step closer to that upper B tier ethno state that I'm working on, a sequel was officially greenlit and announced to be in the works. The enthusiasm that I saw when this announcement came about made sense. An already successful book trilogy means that it's easy to make it into a successful movie franchise like Lord of the Rings. But then I remembered, oh yeah, the movie is going to be a lot of people's entry point to the universe, which is not a bad thing. I need to clarify that. Now, even though I like all three of the Wild Robot books, I think that the first one is the best by a pretty big margin. So let me go into a bit more detail about the ending. Roz has this transponder that allows the company that made her to pinpoint her location in case she gets lost, and she's gonna use it once she does the thing with Brightbill. But then she's like, I have to know if he makes it through migration, and she cuts it off right before the signal gets sent. Then she saves all the animals from the snowstorm, hibernates, and wakes up in spring when the geese have returned. Turns out though that Roz's actions were just enough to have Universal Dynamics come to the woods with the goal of retrieving and resetting her through an army of Ricos led by a robot named Vontra. And I've got a lot more to say about her than you may think, so keep her in the back of your mind. She is briefly captured, but is eventually able to be rescued by Brightbill, Fink, and the other animals who have now been won over by her. But there's enough collateral damage in the process that Roz decides to go back so that she doesn't endanger her family by staying, and a threat of relentless efforts to take her back by force.
We will just keep coming until we have you. We will just
Keep coming until
we have.
It still ends on an optimistic note though, with a stronger sense of community with the animals, and the last scene being Brightbill having a reunion with Roz. I bring this ending up because of one key departure from the original text that's relevant to what's in store for the movie as a franchise. The actual events themselves aren't different from how they play out in the book. Roz does decide that leaving the island is what's best for everyone. What is different though is what information the book chooses to leave us with and what Roz is risking if she decides to stay. In the aftermath of the movie's final battle, she mostly comes out unscathed, whereas in the book she gets damaged in a way that can only be fixed by the people who made her. In that context, both the reader and Roz are still unaware of who those people are because of her amnesia. These motivations overlap with the lingering fear that being on the island will endanger everyone and provides more urgency to the circumstances, especially since we're unsure if Roz will be reunited with the only family she knows again. It feels like the best course of action for herself and the others around her, and more significantly, there's a stronger incentive to see what happens next. It's no longer just wanting to see more of your favorite characters, but also offering you with concrete questions you want to have the answers to that go beyond simply what happens next. It is important to take note of the fact that keeping the cliffhanger ending of the first book would be a risk if the higher-ups decided it wasn't worth continuing, so I understand why Chris Sanders made the changes he did. And I don't think this moment is any less sincere in the movie, largely due to it not shying away from how everyone has changed for the better because of her influence. Brightbill has more confidence, Fink has more humility, and Roz, thanks to them, has more empathy. But the lack of idealism I have about this version of the story being turned into a franchise can be traced back to those last few seconds. Removing the other factors that come into play with her decision comes at a major cost, because you kind of need those in order to make the plot of the second book work as a film. It is about Roz having to escape, but everything that happens in this location is also a way of progressing an arc of self-actualization by discovering things about herself, and coming to terms with the fact that her true home is in the wilderness. A character arc that feels complete in the confines of this movie. Her making the autonomous decision to leave, having full knowledge of her origins with there being no real benefit for herself since she has all the answers. She no longer needs to learn that lesson that where she truly belongs is in the wild. But that's where my thoughts about Vantra come in, because she's an antagonist whose existence is limited to the movie, a centralized manifestation of what the Ricos are supposed to represent as an idea. She's also not an active antagonist for a lot of the movie, and a sequel being in the works make me wonder if the creative team made that decision intentionally. Her limited screen time is pretty much the only real weak point of the movie for me that could easily be rectified in the next one. I know she does end up getting destroyed, but if she is from the same company as Roz, I don't see why she couldn't be rebuilt and take on a more prominent role in the future. Mainly because she's just a cooler version of Jack Horner in my opinion.
Well, I like to spread the good word of atheism.
And to be as vague as possible, in the event that they include the most important character that Roz interacts with in the second book, I'm pretty confident that Vantra is gonna be connected to them somehow. I didn't include that bit in the opening about reductive sequel discourse for no reason, because it is very reductive nowadays. So while how fast the announcement was made had me giving Dreamworks the side eye, I don't want this critique to be misinterpreted as me being opposed to a Wild Robot sequel, but rather that the changes they made here lead me to believe that they should put a good amount of distance from the narrative of the book series moving forward in order to keep its cohesion, by focusing on potentially new themes and character arcs that work well with this story. Basically do the opposite of what How to Train Your Dragon the Hidden World did. And as to whether or not I think Dreamworks and Chris Sanders can pull that off, we'll just have to wait and see. It's like Pinktail said.
Patience is the key.
Yeah, I didn't know for sure if I had it in me to finish this. Keep in mind I've got about 6 more months before I'm 21, so this is what you get for now. So in the long process of making this video as a small, casual way of tuning out the stress that I'm feeling about the immediate future for both myself and the world at large, I've been listening to a lot of Sabrina Carpenter. Mainly songs from her older albums, partially for nostalgic reasons, but also to see her evolution as a songwriter being one of the biggest musical stars in the world right now. And during this binge, I thought to myself, this is who all the success of the Wild Robot reminds me of. Sabrina Carpenter. It always feels rewarding when a work of art or artist you've known about for a long time finally gets mainstream attention. And I'm bringing this up as a preamble to the fact that I didn't write this with the intent of having a clear victor between the two versions of the story, nor do I really feel the need to preoccupy myself with what it represents for the studio as a whole, nor all the possible ways a sequel could go wrong. I can focus on the fact that a story so integral and deeply personal to my adolescence is getting to be experienced by more people. Having the chance to say I was there at the very beginning is a really nice feeling to have, and again, almost everything done in relation to it culminates into the best film to come out of Dreamworks while under Universal.
Hello.
Okay, second best, but you get the idea. So instead of ending this off with some grand statement, I'm gonna be uncharacteristically cliche by simply leaving you with the statement that The Wild Robot, both as a movie and as an adaptation, is a masterpiece.